I didn't go looking for a lost civilization. I wasn't even reading about world's fairs. I was chasing something far more ordinary. Construction records from the 1890s, trying to understand how anyone built big, complex buildings fast, how they moved material, how they scheduled labor, what fast meant before tower cranes and power tools became the default. It was the kind of curiosity you assume you can satisfy in an afternoon. Then one event kept showing up like a watermark on every page. Chicago, 1893. The world's Columbian Exposition. If this story grabs you, do one thing right now. Save it. Share it with the friend who always says, "That doesn't add up." And leave your best explanation in the comments, because the only way to cut through the fog around the White City is to compare notes in public. Here's the hook that wouldn't let go. The numbers don't feel like history. They feel like a typo. Nearly 200 new buildings spread across roughly 690 acres, raised out of Jackson Park, low. Wet ground along Lake Michigan finished in time for opening day on the 1st of May, 1893, after serious work began in 1891. More than 27 million people passed through the gates in 6 months. They wrote home about a dream city. So bright at night it looked unreal. And then, within a year, most of it was gone, burned, dismantled, scavenged, and reduced to photographs and second-hand awe. That's the official shape of it. A temporary city, we're told. A spectacular, meticulously staged show. A classical mirage. But if you sit with the details, if you stop letting the phrase temporary buildings do all the heavy lifting, questions start breeding. Start with the centerpiece everyone cites because it sounds like a dare. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building. The dimensions are usually given as 1,687 feet long by 787 feet wide. Contemporary accounts called it the largest roofed structure ever built at the time, with roughly 44 acres under a single roof. Even if you grant it was a vast exhibition hall rather than a masonry cathedral, you still have to ask the unromantic question no myth can dodge. How? Not how did they design it. Architects can draw anything. How did they source the iron, fabricate the trusses, ship them, stage them, lift them, align them, and bolt them together in the early 1890s on a schedule that would still make a modern project manager sweat? The story repeated in mainstream summaries is that much of the White City wasn't stone at all. It was staff. A fast, moldable artificial stone finish made primarily from plaster, mixed with a little cement, and strengthened with fibers like jute or cloth. Staff could be cast in molds, installed quickly over wood or metal framing, and painted to read as gleaming white marble from a distance. A material built for illusion. Cheap, light, fast, theatrical. So the White City becomes, in the official telling, a brilliant trick. A stage set on a heroic scale. A temporary coating over ordinary skeletons. And yet, when you look at the photographs, especially the construction shots, you can feel two opposing truths pressing against each other. Yes, you can see framing, scaffolding, the bones, but you can also see coordination, repetition, standardization, a system. That's where the modern internet barges in. If you've spent time in TikTok stitches, YouTube hidden history documentaries, or Reddit threads, you know the rhythm. Someone posts a crisp photo of the Court of Honor and writes, "No way, this is temporary." Another zooms in on columns. That's stone. Someone else insists the buildings were excavated, not built. Then the keywords arrive like a spell. Tartaria, mud flood, reset. They tore it down so we couldn't study it. It's easy to mock, but I'm more interested in why the theory exists at all. People don't invent elaborate alternatives for events that feel coherent. They invent them when the official story seems to skip steps, especially when the only proof most of us ever see is a handful of photos and a paragraph in a textbook. Now bring in electricity, because electricity is where the White City stops sounding like a plaster trick and starts sounding like the future arriving in a single season. The 1893 fair is remembered as a turning point in the War of the Currents. Westinghouse won the contract to light the Exposition using alternating current based on Tesla's system, beating Edison's direct current proposal. On opening day, the story goes, President Grover Cleveland pressed a button, and the fair burst into light tens of thousands of incandescent lamps in an instant, plus brilliant arc lights for major spaces. Visitors described it like a revelation. A city made of daylight after dark. There were 12 enormous AC generators in Machinery Hall, described in contemporary technical writing as each capable of powering vast numbers of lamps and requiring enormous horsepower. This wasn't parlor electricity. It was a power plant presented as entertainment. And Tesla didn't just appear. He performed. High-frequency currents, wireless effects that made lamps glow without wires, rotating magnetic fields that turned objects like they were enchanted. Millions watched a public spectacle where the boundary between science and magic looked thin enough to tear. So here's the tension. If the buildings were merely temporary shells, why stage permanent-scale systems inside them? Why build a network big enough to become a global demonstration of modern power? Why lay down deep infrastructure, transport, water, drainage if the plan was always demolition? A reasonable answer exists, and it isn't conspiratorial. World's fairs were prototype cities. The point wasn't durability, it was persuasion. Temporary architecture made financial sense because the point was the spectacle, not long-term property value. And the infrastructure, while extensive, was simply what it took to operate a city-sized event. That explanation is plausible. It's also incomplete, because it doesn't address the emotional core of the mystery: speed. From early 1891 to opening day in May 1893 is about 28 months. At peak, thousands of workers were on site. Some accounts cite around 40,000 during the hardest push. That number is a clue. Industrialization wasn't only machines. It was organization. Rail networks feeding lumber, iron, glass, and plaster on a schedule. Factories stamping, cutting, and casting components in bulk. So the construction site became less about crafting each piece and more about assembling a kit. Seen that way, the fair starts to resemble something we recognize: prefabrication, modular ornament, reusable molds, standard framing, a gigantic production line spread across acres. Staff itself is a perfect example. Online, it gets dismissed as just plaster, as if plaster can't become serious architecture when you're willing to engineer the process. But staff was designed to be fast, cast in detailed molds, reinforced, set quickly, and then attached like a skin. If you can mass-produce ornament, you can make an ordinary frame look like Rome. And once you understand that, the photos make a different kind of sense. Not ancient ruins, but industrial artistry beauty assembled at scale. Then comes the ending. After the fair closed on the 30th of October 1893, parts of the grounds burned. A major fire on the 8th of January 1894 destroyed the casino and swept along the peristyle into Music Hall and damaged sections of the manufacturer's building. Reports describe crowds watching in the cold as white facades darkened and collapsed into blackened plaster and charred framing. Online, the fire becomes motive. Convenient, people say. No accidents. But a non-myth answer also exists. Much of the White City was built from combustible materials, wood framing and staff. Security and maintenance costs for an empty fairground were high. The Depression of 1893 squeezed budgets. The land was intended to return to park use. Fire, vandalism, and salvage are what you expect when a temporary city loses its purpose. So why does the "they erased it" interpretation persist? Because one building survived, or at least, one building's story complicates everything. The Palace of Fine Arts was built more solidly because art lenders demanded fireproof construction. It remained after the fair and ultimately became the Museum of Science and Industry. A key nuance gets lost online. The structure people visit today reflects major rebuilding and reconstruction in the early 20th century, with a permanent limestone exterior replacing the aging staff. Still, the underlying point stands. The planners could build to last when they chose to. So the real question isn't, could they? It's, why didn't they? More often, money is the boring answer, and boring answers are usually true. A permanent city of marble and masonry would have cost a fortune and taken longer. A temporary dream could be made beautiful enough for 6 months and then let go. The fair was building a memory, not a neighborhood. But that vanishing is not merely historical. It's psychological. We are built to distrust stories that end with, "and then the miracle was dismantled." We want relics. We want ruins. We want stone that proves the wonder. When there are no ruins, the imagination supplies them. That's why Tartaria content spreads. Not because every viewer believes in a hidden empire, but because the format offers what the official story withholds: a clean motive, a villain, a reason the wonder didn't stay. If you want to understand why the excavated, not built idea keeps resurfacing online, watch how the claims travel. A creator posts, "They built this in months." Another stitches it, and then they demolished it. A third adds a slideshow of sunken floors and says, "Mud flood." The next person drops an antique map labeled Tartary and says, "They erased a whole empire." None of these pieces proves the next one, but the algorithm doesn't care about proof. It cares about momentum. You don't have to accept any of that to learn from it. Treat it like a stress test. When a story spreads this fast, it's often because it's touching a real weakness in the official narrative. An area where the public has no intuitive model and no practical picture in their mind. For most of us, 1,893 construction equals hand tools and horses. We don't picture industrial supply chains, standardized fabrication, and tens of thousands of laborers working under intense deadlines. We don't picture a world where temporary can still mean massive and where stage set can still mean engineering. So when the White City shows up in a photograph looking too perfect, the brain reaches for explanations that match the feeling. It must be older than we're told, more advanced than we're told, or hidden from us on purpose. But there's a more grounded kind of wonder available, if we're willing to take it. Imagine being a visitor in 1893 who has never seen a generator hall, never seen a city illuminated like noon at midnight. Imagine stepping into an architectural court where everything is aligned, everything is white, everything is reflected in water, and then the lights come on and it looks like the world has been upgraded overnight. No wonder people used religious language. No wonder they wrote home like they'd seen paradise. It wasn't paradise, it was design. But design can be just as overwhelming when you've never been targeted by it before. And then imagine returning a year later to find it gone. Not closed. Gone. Stripped, leveled, quiet. That kind of absence is a force. It leaves a shape in the mind. It makes you feel like someone took something from you. Maybe that's the deepest reason the White City refuses to settle into history. It wasn't meant to be a place. It was meant to be a feeling. And feelings don't come with receipts. So yes, keep asking the hard questions. Keep demanding the boring details. Contracts, foundries, shipping routes, labor rosters, engineering write-ups, salvage logs. And also keep one softer question in your pocket, because it may explain more than any conspiracy ever will. What happens to a culture when it learns, all at once, that reality can be staged? That lesson was demonstrated in plaster, steel, and electric light in 1893. The buildings are gone. The questions remain. And if you're still here reading, you're already part of the long echo that proves the White City didn't really disappear, it just changed form. There's also a historical detail that matters more than it gets credit for. Chicago wasn't building from nothing. After 1871, the city rebuilt aggressively. By the 1890s, it had companies that could fabricate steel, mills that could pump out lumber, railroads that could deliver material by the trainload, and an army of tradespeople used to working at pace. The fair was not a lone miracle in a sleepy town. It was a national project dropped into an industrial engine that was already spinning. And yet, even with that context, I understand why the fair keeps getting recast as a mystery. Because what survives in popular culture isn't the project management, it's the mood. The White City is remembered as purity and brightness, so the stories that attach themselves to it are either angels or demons. That's why Holmes keeps swallowing the narrative. When modern audiences hear 1,893 Chicago, they often hear Murder Castle before they hear largest roofed building on earth. Even if every rumor about Holmes were stripped away tomorrow, the effect would remain. A single sensational horror story is easier to package than a system of logistics, labor, design, and finance. So try a different lens. Instead of asking, was this built or excavated? Ask, what did this teach people to want? The fair taught Americans to want bright streets, monumental civic buildings, parks that felt curated rather than accidental, and technology presented as wonder rather than utility. It also taught a darker lesson. If something can be staged at this scale, then what else might be staged? That suspicion, more than any specific map or photograph, may be the real seed that later grew into hidden history narratives. If you want to push this beyond vibes, here's a practical move you can make today. Pick one structure, just one, and track its material story end to end. Who designed it? Who built the frame? Where did the iron come from? What factory cast the ornaments? What did staff panels weigh? And how were they attached? What happened to the salvage afterward? When you do that, the White City stops being a single impossible object and becomes hundreds of solvable problems, still huge, still impressive, but no longer mystical by default. One last request. When you reply, don't just say Tartaria or it was all staff. Give me the missing mechanism, the one step that, once you see it, makes everything click.